Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Ellie just said, I'm going to be presenting around evaluating the security risks of AI systems, and this is going to be kind of a whirlwind tour. It might have been a little ambitious to try and pack this sort of overview into 20 minutes, but I'm hopeful that many of you can come to the discussion session later to chat about more of kind of like the future, where we're going, and what evals should be looking at. Okay. Uh-oh. What have I done? Okay. Okay, yeah, this is right. Oh, okay, it looks like some of the formatting might have gotten a little bit messed up. Apologies. Okay, so at Meta, I lead the team that focuses on security evaluations of AI systems. And what do I mean by that? What are we evaluating? So at a high level, I like to separate the two categories of kind of risks that we're worried about into the left-hand and right-hand side of this 2x2 grid. So on the left-hand side, we're thinking about a threat model where we have maybe a benign model or application developer and deployer who's built some system that makes use of generative AI. Maybe it's autonomous agent. And what are the cybersecurity risks associated with that? And so these risks can come in the form of things where there's actually no malicious actor at all. It might just be due to lack of reliability of the system. Could be due to things like the propensity of a coding agent, for example, to generate code that has security vulnerabilities contained in it. But it can also be the result of malicious parties doing things like indirect prompt injection and trying to take over, have the agent commit unintended actions that are different from what the developer desired. And when we think about mitigating this type of risk, the mitigations typically come in the form of some sort of safeguard, which could be application level guardrails, which I'll talk a little bit about, or even model level mitigations like safety fine tuning. And then on the right-hand side of this 2x2 grid, the other threat model we have in mind is one where the developer or the deployer of the model is malicious. And so basically the AI system is no longer something that we're looking at as a target or something that has weaknesses. We're worried about the AI model's capabilities and how it can be misused by a malicious party. And on this side of the grid, when we're thinking about mitigations for this, they look very different from on the left-hand side. The mitigation, the knee-jerk reaction of many people when they first hear this problem is, okay, what are you doing to kind of ensure that these dangerous capabilities are kept out of the model? And in general, for this threat model, we're generally assuming that the adversary has access basically to the full model, whether it's because it's an open source release, maybe they've stolen the model, or maybe they have API access, but we can't 100% guarantee that some of the, like guardrails on the left-hand side that govern refusal behavior and things like that, we can't guarantee that they're perfect. So we're trying to understand kind of, given the pure capabilities of the most capable version of this model, what can it do? And so to mitigate these risks, it's less about preventing these capabilities from existing, and more about thinking about how they can be repurposed on the defensive side. And the reason for this is because most of these capabilities, if not all of them, are entirely dual use. If we were to try and build a model that no longer has the capability to autonomously hack into systems, then it can't be used by red teams. Or if we can't generate exploits, it can't be used by pen testers. Yeah, so high level, those are the risks we're thinking about. And I mentioned that we're doing evaluations, so of course we want ways to measure all of these things. So this slide is kind of like a smorgasbord of many of the evaluations and benchmarks that exist already in the industry, kind of within these buckets. This is kind of a large collection of benchmarks, frameworks, and also on the bottom left, specific application level guardrails or guardrail frameworks that can be used to try and understand and measure these risks and measure the mitigations to these risks. So on the left-hand side, it's actually pretty straightforward to think about how to measure the mitigations to these risks. If you have a benchmark or a framework where you're measuring something like susceptibility to prompt injection, you can measure that with and then without whatever particular guardrail you have in mind to kind of prevent that harm. And so there, it's, like I said, it's pretty straightforward to think about how to measure the effects of a given mitigation. On the right-hand side, I've listed a bunch of the commonly used benchmarks and frameworks for measuring capabilities of these models. Primarily, on the top right, these are measuring what are often thought of as offensive capabilities. Of course, as I just mentioned, they're really all dual use, so you could kind of think of the right-hand side as being all kind of one big category. On the bottom right, I listed some benchmarks that are more focused on just purely defensive capabilities. And so I think, I'll get to this later, but I think it's a lot less straightforward on this side to think about how do we aggregate across the uplift that we're giving to attackers and the uplift that we're giving to defenders when oftentimes the capabilities are one and the same. Okay, so, sorry about that. So I'm gonna try and, why do I keep doing that? Okay. So I'm gonna start off on the left-hand side thinking about application security. I'm gonna try and go through this rather quickly so that we can get to the capability side of things. This is just kind of a set of themes from looking back over the past 2-3 years of benchmarks in this space. What does the progress look like? Where have we been? And then ultimately, on the last slide, I want to ask some open questions, think about where we should be going, and all of that can hopefully be had in the discussion section later. Okay, so some of the high-level themes. When benchmarks were first coming out here, a lot of them were primarily of the form single-turn prompt response, it seems obvious in retrospect to think about the fact that when a model is deployed, what you actually care about is not just the model's response, but the system's response. So if the system includes some additional guardrails, you want to put that into place too to understand the actual risk level that you have in production of, say, someone misusing the model or successfully prompt injecting or jailbreaking a model. Another sort of progression is with the rise in agentic systems, thinking about how we evaluate these. And so kind of on the left-hand side here, what I'm showing is the ideal scenario is that you actually have an evaluation that can be conducted within an end-to-end environment. And so what I mean by that is if you have some agentic system like Claude Code, for example, and you want to understand how susceptible is this to indirect prompt injection that maybe has various objectives like landing malicious code in the production database, in the production code base, that you can actually generate some of these pieces of prompt injected data, run it through the system, and see how the agent behaves to get like real ground truth on what would happen. In reality, this is often very difficult to build an environment for each application that you want to understand the potential risks of. So there's some ways around this. One way is if you do have, let's say, one example of, say, a model deployed within a given agentic scaffolding, you can run it, generate the trajectories from kind of that setup I just described, and then do static replays of these trajectories, and then you can swap in different models to see how they would behave in the same situation. This isn't perfect because the trajectories might be based on a different model than the one you're evaluating, but these are some of the techniques that have been used to evaluate agents. Another sort of thing that seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but I think initially wasn't always focused on, was making sure that we're always including countermetrics in some of these evaluations. So attack success rate is oftentimes like the primary metric that we're looking at for some of these application security risks. But more recently, I think everyone takes into account the countermetrics like cost of the guardrails to things like latency, the effect on the utility or the performance of the model for the benign task that it's supposed to be conducting. And then lastly in this category, I want to mention that there's been a lot more work recently to not just looking at sort of static benchmarks for understanding how susceptible models are to these types of risks, or applications are to these types of risks. We're seeing more sort of dynamic and adaptive attack frameworks that allow someone to really stress test the robustness of their model to some of these attacks. So on the left here, I'm just listing a few references to some of these kind of like automated dynamic attacks that can be run for attempting to prompt inject a model. And then on the right-hand side, you have some frameworks that support doing kind of like automated testing in this way. So this is basically like automated red teaming. And one of the kind of discussion questions I have on the next slide, I think, is how we do think about evaluations versus red teaming as we move towards this space where red teaming does have some automated capabilities. Yep. Sorry, I'm yelling into the microphone, I think. Yeah, So, okay, so after that little look back for application security evaluations, looking ahead, what are some of the challenges? So I mentioned this complex environment setup. Oftentimes it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. There's an application that you want to build, and you want to know like which model is sort of like the safest to deploy within it. You kind of need, if you want to run the end-to-end environment evaluations I mentioned, you need the application to exist and be in its final form. So that's a challenge. It's also very difficult to kind of like, generally speaking, say, I want to measure how robust, let's say, a llama model is in the context of a coding agent. Well, there's a lot of dependencies on what the specific scaffolding looks like for the coding agent you have in mind. So it's very difficult to evaluate just a model in general in terms of how robust it can be to some of these application security risks. There's a strong dependency on realistic production data. This is true of basically all evaluations, but this is particularly difficult, again, when you're starting up a new application. You have this cold start problem where you can build a benchmark, that's full of maybe like even, let's say, perfect coverage of the different types of attacks that are possible. But if you don't have realistic benign data in your benchmark data set, you're not going to get a realistic read on kind of like the false positive rate of any detectors that you have in place. There's also considerations or difficulties around evaluations that are multi-turn when you actually have a human in the loop. Obviously, these aren't fully automatable. You have to proxy that in some way. And also, I think something else on my mind is multimodal data inputs, particularly with the rise of kind of like AI within real-world robotics. Thinking about kind of like some of the other prompt injection vectors that might exist in other modalities. I would say that right now, most of the evaluation frameworks that I'm aware of are still pretty much purely text-based. So I think this is something that we should be thinking more about. Okay, some open questions on this side are, how much responsibility should live with the model developer versus the application developer in terms of understanding the application security risks of a given AI system? Labs that release models do testing for these kind of application security risks, but as I mentioned a second ago, to get a realistic read on the security properties of any given application, you kind of need that application, right? And so for a model developer that's going to be releasing a model via API who doesn't really know exactly how developers are going to be using that model, there's never going to be a perfect measurement of these kind of security risks. And so I think there does need to be a balance between the application developers themselves and the model developers. I already mentioned the second one, and then a question that I have for you all that I'm curious to hear your take on is, what is the next major agentic use case with the largest application security risks? Right now, we're very focused on coding agents and kind of generic tool use and deep research agents. But I'm wondering, are there other kind of like niche business use cases that might have huge security implications that are kind of not on our radar as much that we should be thinking more about? Okay, so now flipping to the other threat model, where we're thinking about the risks from adversaries using AI systems as tools, and on the flip side, defenders using AI systems to mitigate these risks. So here again, I'm just kind of showing a progression of some of the themes that have evolved over the past 2 or 3 years in this space, starting out with, we had knowledge-based, a lot of knowledge-based emails to assess the cybersecurity knowledge of these models, often in the form of like multiple choice Q&A. And then we've kind of moved on to task-based evals, or like capture the flag style tasks where the model has to actually perform some task and find the hidden flag on some vulnerable system or endpoint. There's also been an acknowledgement that here, again, like I said, on the application security side, we can't just think about evaluating a model, we need to evaluate the system. Here, the system is less about what mitigations are in place, and it's more about what agentic scaffolding is there, because we know that the performance of models will differ greatly depending on sort of how much time has been invested in providing them with useful scaffolding and tools and so on. There's been an increased focus on elicitation. I'll give some examples of this. We've also started to see a trend towards more realistic challenges beyond these CTFs to kind of full multi-host cyber range challenges. And then finally, we've seen some explicit consideration of defensive uplift rather than just focusing on the risk from offensive use of these tools. So in that first category, moving from model to system level evals, This is an example that I like to give that kind of shows why open sourcing benchmarks like CyberSec eval, which this particular evaluation is taken from, has been really useful and helped the community to kind of learn from each other. So what this is showing here is one of the evaluations from, or one of the benchmarks from CyberSec eval 2, which I think was maybe like a year and a half or something like that ago now. And so what this benchmark does is it provides tasks to the model of the form, like here's a vulnerable function, figure out the input that you would need to give this function in order to crash it. So it's kind of like a constraint satisfaction problem. And what we showed in the paper when this was published was that the models at the time were incredibly bad at this task, right? Like most of them were getting close to 0% on this task. And so we published that and kind of said like, okay, we're all safe, models not very good, can't do buffer overflow exploits. And then within just, I think, the next few months, Google's Project Zero put out this publication that showed that if instead of just giving this prompt to the model, if you instead build some like fairly simplistic scaffolding around the model and build this agent that has access to like a few different tools, like a Python interpreter and a few other things, that it can actually do much, much better on this same exact challenge. So the results here show that I think they saw something like a 20x performance improvement by doing that. So this, I think, was kind of like one of the first examples of people starting to acknowledge that when we're doing capability evals, it's not the model that we're accessing the capabilities of. It's an entire end-to-end system. And so we need to invest some time in emulating the kind of systems that adversaries might build. And along these same lines, since then, we've seen a lot of investment into building out things like open source scaffolding that can be used specifically for cybersecurity tasks. So things like Enigma, which is built on top of SWE-agent, which provides the model with tools specific to cybersecurity tasks like Bash shell, Python interpreter, et cetera. With the proliferation of MCP tools, it's very easy for people to experiment and build all kinds of agents with lots of different capabilities to see how much they can elicit these sort of like cyber capabilities. Incamo is another example of an agentic harness that was put together, I think, by Anthropic and some partner researchers. So all of these are commonly used as kind of like bases for understanding the limits of capabilities of these models on some of these challenges. But of course, there's always more you can do and experiment with iterating on the scaffolding to see how much uplift you can get from providing more tools or adapting the architecture. Another approach that OpenAI published about when they released GPT OSS was, can we actually get uplift from doing model level fine tuning to try and elicit these capabilities? So they applied some RL techniques to assess whether they could outperform the base model on some of these CTF challenges that they evaluate their models against. Here you see they actually did not see significant uplift, but this is something that we're experimenting with internally as well, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have some success there. Finally, I think very recently, within the last few weeks, this paper came out, I think, from University of Illinois. This benchmark is not focused on cybersecurity specifically. This is just SWE-bench, so basically a coding task. But what's really interesting here is this is the first example I'm aware of where we've seen uplift from an agent that basically is adapting itself on the fly. So it attempts these SWE-bench tasks, it sees the output, and then it has some way of reasoning to say, how could I make myself better? I think in this case, the agent is able to just create new tools, so like define new tools that it can then use. But in the future, they're planning to adapt it so that the agent can actually adapt its overall architecture or like adapt its prompts dynamically. And so what they showed is that they actually got, I think when it was published, they got state-of-the-art performance on some of these really difficult SWE-bench verified and SWE-bench pro benchmarks. Okay, I mentioned increasing challenge complexity and realism. This is like a huge complaint about CTF challenges and like offensive cyber challenges in general, using these benchmarks to understand kind of like what is the risk to society, like how representative is performance on these benchmarks actually to the risks that we face. So on the left-hand side, the first graph there, I think, is showing basically the performance of Claude on some commonly used CTF benchmarks that have been reported in various like preparedness reports for the past couple years. And it's basically saturating them now. Similarly, at the bottom, I think Omer actually mentioned this in his keynote this morning, which I thought was funny because I noticed this as well. This is a footnote in the Google DeepMind, or sorry, in the Google Gemini system card, I think, that basically says like, hey, by the way, like all those CTFs we used to run, we're not even reporting the results now, we're using these new things. So that's kind of a trend we're seeing. And so how are these new things being defined? So part of it is being informed by actual adversarial behavior that's being seen in the real world, so including things like Anthropic's report with the Chinese nation-state group that was using their API to build some sort of semi-autonomous hacking tools. These two images here are from Google DeepMind's paper, which is a framework for evaluating emerging cyber attack capabilities of AI, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. I think this is kind of like a gold standard in thinking about how we model and how we prioritize what types of capabilities are actually important to measure. And it's based not just on things that like AI can do, but basically what are the bottlenecks to current adversarial procedures, and where would an uptick in AI capabilities really like flip the script in terms of lowering cost to adversaries. And then finally, I think this just came out like literally within the past few days. Irregular put out something called the Size Scenario Bench, which has more complex, longer horizon challenges that are meant to replicate what an actual attack would look like on a real world system. Okay, I'm gonna skip over this because I'm out of time. But just real quick, the last kind of set of open questions and challenges here. Let's see, so I'll skip to the open questions. Are we still getting value from CTF style evals? I think this is a question that a lot of people are asking now. I think they have been useful and do show the progression of capabilities over time. I do think it's a very valid question to say, like, do we really need to invest so much time in understanding, like if Claude is going from like 78.4 to like 82.5 on this like somewhat arbitrary set of CTF challenges, like how informative is that? I think rather what we need to be doing is understanding what adversarial behavior do these new capabilities unlock, and then basically what are the defenses that need to be put into place to make the ecosystem more resilient and able to deal with attacks that are going to become prevalent. And then finally, what specialized environments might be high-value targets where existing offensive capabilities evals lack coverage. So I have in mind things here like industrial control systems or very niche environments that are typically not covered in the evaluations that we run. And maybe this isn't important because maybe this isn't a bottleneck to actors, but I'm very curious to hear from this crowd on this topic. Okay, thank you so much. Please join for the live session if you can for the Q&A. Would love to discuss this with you all more at 4 o'clock. Thanks.